There are moments in history when the earth itself seems to groan. When civilizations collapse not with a whisper, but with a roar of fire, famine, and steel. Imagine the shores of the Mediterranean around 1200 BC. The sea alive with sails, the coastlines glittering with proud cities. Palaces in Mycenae, temples in Thebes, the mighty citadels of the Hittites. The bustling harbors of Ugarit, where merchants bartered copper, tin, and wine beneath the burning Levantine sun. This was a world at its height, the imperial age of antiquity, when kings carved their victories into stone and armies thundered across the plains in bronze chariots. To live then was to believe the order of the world eternal, the gods unshaken, the empires indestructible. And then, darkness. The ships came first. Strange, swift, unnumbered, they appeared on the horizon like a storm. We call them the sea peoples. But to their victims, they were less a people than a force of nature, an apocalypse made flesh. They fell upon coasts like wolves. Cities burned, temples collapsed, granaries went up in flames, the lifeblood of kingdoms drained away in weeks. Imagine the fire rising above the walls of Ugarit, the last desperate tablet sent to an ally. The enemy is at the gates. Our ships are lost. Send help at once. No answer came. This was no isolated calamity. Across the span of a single generation, the known world shattered. Hattusa, proud capital of the Hittite Empire, was abandoned, its palaces reduced to rubble. The Mycenaean kings, heirs of Agamemnon, vanished into myth, their fortresses left to weeds. Egypt itself, the most enduring of all civilizations, barely survived wave after wave of invasion. And though it claimed victory, the pharaoh's triumph was hollow. An empire gutted, its glory spent. It was as if some unseen hand had swept the board clear, toppling kingdoms as a child scatters carved figurines across the floor. Trade collapsed. The great arteries of commerce that carried tin from Britain and copper from Cyprus withered. Without them, bronze itself, the very metal of their age, became scarce. Armies could not be forged. Economies broke. Even the gift of writing faltered. Scripts disappeared, records ceased. And in Greece, the world fell silent for centuries, leaving only ruins and echoes. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse. But to those who lived it, it must have felt like the end of the world. Imagine being a farmer whose harvest fails in a season of drought, a merchant watching the harbors turn empty, a scribe realizing his script is the last of its kind. Imagine the terror of hearing that the next city over has burned, that the refugees at your gates speak of horsemen and fire and gods that no longer answer. This was no slow decline. It was an apocalypse. And yet, from this chaos, a new world would rise. Out of the silence of Greece, Homer would one day sing. From the ashes of Canaan would come Israel. From the twilight of empires, Assyria and Phoenicia would carve new dominions. But before rebirth came the plunge, the deep trough in the sine wave of history. The valley where hope seemed lost and humanity stood at the brink. The Bronze Age collapse is not just an ancient tale. It is a mirror, a reminder that civilization is fragile, that networks of trade, technology, and power can crumble in the face of war, climate, and hubris. For the men and women of that age, the world truly ended. For us, it is a story of warning, an echo across 3 millennia, whispering that no empire, however mighty, is eternal. This is their story. The triumph and hubris of kingdoms, the sudden storm of invasion, the long silence that followed, and the uncertain dawn of a new age. The Mediterranean burned once. and the memory of that fire still glows in our histories, reminding us of the day the world fell. Before the storm, there was brilliance. The Mediterranean world of the late Bronze Age was a tapestry woven with gold threads of commerce, conquest, and culture. To stand at the heart of that world around 1250 BC was to witness one of humanity's first experiments in globalization. From the palaces of Mycenae to the gates of Hattusa, from the Nile Delta to the shores of Ugarit, empires and kingdoms were bound together not only by arms, but by trade routes that carried wealth, knowledge, and ambition across sea and sand. The very air seemed thick with confidence. Kings ruled with divine mandate, their power proclaimed in stone inscriptions and temples that reached toward heaven. Egyptian pharaohs still wore crowns of godlike authority. The Hittite great king commanded an empire that stretched across Anatolia. The Mycenaean lords, heirs of legendary heroes, built fortresses crowned with lion gates. Even the smaller city-states, Byblos, Ugarit, Cyprus, flourished as nodes in a vast network, their harbors buzzing with ships heavy with copper, tin, oil, and wine. It was a world where bronze was more than metal. It was destiny. To forge bronze was to master the art of war, to equip soldiers with gleaming swords and chariots whose wheels rattled like thunder. And to sustain bronze, kingdoms reached far. Tin from as distant as the mountains of Afghanistan or the Isles of Britain, copper from Cyprus, timber from Lebanon. A failure in this network meant not only economic strain, but the loss of the very foundation of military power. If one squints at history through the playful lens of a game like Age of Empires, this world looked like a grand multiplayer map where nearly every civilization had reached its imperial age. Wonders rose in stone. Armies marched with elite units, and trade flowed across the seas in glowing routes of prosperity. Each empire was strong, not because it stood alone, but because it stood in balance with others. The collapse of one might have seemed unthinkable, for the web appeared indestructible. And yet, even at its height, cracks spread beneath the marble. The Hittite Empire, though mighty in its chariots and iron weapons, struggled with rebellious vassals and the ever-looming threat of rival powers. Mycenaean kings quarreled among themselves, each fortress eyeing the other with suspicion. Egypt, despite its monuments and armies, bore the strain of maintaining far-flung frontiers and feeding a swelling population. Beneath the grandeur of palaces and temples lay fields worked by peasants who often knew hunger better than abundance. The climate, too, conspired. Scholars now speak of years of drought, failed harvests, and migrations driven by famine. The Mediterranean sun, once generous, grew cruel. Granaries emptied, and murmurs of unrest stirred. A society dependent on fragile agricultural cycles and vulnerable trade routes was like a warrior clad in shining bronze but standing on clay feet. And then there was hubris. Every empire in its prime believes itself eternal. Kings imagined their monuments would outlast the winds, their armies crush any foe. Yet history whispers another truth, that the higher the tower of pride, the deeper the fall. Even in the quiet before the storm, the signs were there. Scribes recording pleas for grain, envoys reporting border unrest, merchants complaining of pirates nibbling at the lifelines of trade. The mighty still held feasts, but the shadows at the edge of torchlight lengthened. To the men and women of the age, life seemed ordered and unshakable. Farmers tilled fields, children learned hymns to gods who promised protection. Kings prepared campaigns with the same confidence their fathers had known. Ships left harbor heavy with goods, expecting safe arrival in foreign ports. Priests lit incense in temples where statues of deities glowed in the firelight. In the illusion of stability, the world spun on. But from our vantage point, we know that this was the golden calm before the tempest. The Mediterranean, so bright with sails and stone, was like a game map filled with glittering cities and proud armies. Yet all of it stood on the edge of erasure. A single disruption in the trade of tin, a single wave of raiders from the sea, a single season of famine could unravel the network, thread by fragile thread. The world before the fall was not a world of ignorance, but of achievement. Not a dark age, but a luminous one. And perhaps that is what makes its collapse so haunting. For when we look at the Bronze Age before 1200 BC, we see not barbarians fumbling in darkness, but a civilization as advanced, interconnected, and confident as any before Rome. Its downfall would not merely be the death of kings, it would be the unraveling of the very fabric of a system that had bound continents together. Thus, the curtain rises. A world in full splendor, unsuspecting of its doom. A Mediterranean lit with the glow of prosperity, its cities like stars upon the sea. And somewhere beyond the horizon, ships were already being built, fires were being stoked, and a tide of chaos prepared to sweep it all away. If the Bronze Age world glittered with confidence, its empires were the brightest jewels of all. To survey the Mediterranean around 1225 BC was to gaze upon a chessboard crowded with kings who styled themselves as gods, each certain that his dynasty stood upon unshakable stone. Yet beneath the gleam of bronze and gold, their thrones were already set upon sand. Let us walk among these powers, one by one, as if entering the grand hall of an age of empires match, where every civilization has reached the pinnacle of its technology. At first glance, each seems unstoppable. Massed armies, wonders rising to the sky, trade routes glowing with wealth. And yet, in each, the seeds of weakness quietly sprout. Egypt, the eternal kingdom. Here the Nile still flows broad and generous, feeding fields that stretch like emerald ribbons across the desert. Pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties parade in splendor, their temples carved with tales of victory, their palaces echoing with hymns to Amun. Ramses II, remembered as the great warrior king, has already inscribed his triumphs upon stone, boasting of chariots that stormed across Kadesh against the Hittites. His successors sit enthroned in the same majesty, cloaked in the illusion that Egypt's reign is without end. And yet, the truth is different. Beyond the monuments, the empire strains. Grain must feed millions, distant provinces require garrisons, nobles bicker for favor in Thebes and Pi-Ramesses. Drought whispers along the Nile's edges, and with it come murmurs of hunger. Egypt still shines like a jewel, but one whose core is beginning to crack. The Hittite Empire, masters of Anatolia. Northward, in the fortress capital of Hattusa, the great king presides over one of the strongest chariot armies the world has ever seen. Their scribes record treaties with Babylon, confrontations with Egypt, and commands to vassals across Anatolia and northern Syria. They are proud, even arrogant, for they believe themselves heirs to a destiny carved in iron and bronze. But Hittite power is fragile. The empire is ringed by hostile neighbors, Casca raiders in the north, restless vassals in the south. To hold such vast lands requires endless campaigns, endless tribute. Even the royal archives hint at strain, letters begging for grain from Egypt, reports of unrest in the provinces. The empire stands like a wall of stone, but already the mortar is loosening. The Mycenaean lords of Greece. Westward, across the wine-dark sea, the fortresses of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos rise with walls so massive that later Greeks believed only giants could have built them. Here, kings rule from megarons adorned with frescoes of warriors and chariots. They are the heirs of a heroic age, remembered in epic as sons of Atreus and Agamemnon. Their fleets sail to distant ports, bringing back gold, ivory, and slaves. But the Mycenaean world is less a unified kingdom than a family of rival lords, each wary of the other. They compete, they scheme, they drain their people with endless wars of prestige. The very walls that make them seem invincible also betray their fear of one another. A civilization that cannot trust itself is already halfway to ruin. The smaller kingdoms, Ugarit, Byblos, Cyprus. Along the Levantine coast, smaller yet vital players thrive. Their harbors are the lifeblood of the bronze economy. Ugarit, with its tablets recording trade in copper and tin. Byblos, rich with cedar. Cyprus, abundant in ore. These cities are like the market hubs in a game of Age of Empires, where caravans converge and resources flow. Their wealth lies not in armies, but in networks, and networks are fragile. To sever a trade route is to cut the artery of an empire. Each kingdom, each city believed itself enduring. Each wore the mask of stability. But behind the mask lay fragility. The economic system of the Bronze Age was a delicate web stretched across thousands of miles, dependent on good harvests, safe seas, and the cooperation of kings. When the seas turned dangerous, when the rains failed, when enemies multiplied, the web could tear. And once torn, it could not easily be mended. If one listens closely to the records left behind, one can almost hear the unease. A Hittite king writes of famine and begs for Egyptian grain. A Mycenaean tablet lists extraordinary levies of armor, as if preparing for threats unspoken. Ugaritic merchants complain of piracy on the seas. Priests note strange omens in the sky, stars out of place, eclipses that disturb the order of heaven. The surface is calm, but underneath the waters, currents churn. So it was that the Mediterranean, though dazzling, stood on a knife's edge. Like an Age of Empires empire stretched too thin, its villagers overworked, its resources strained, its soldiers numerous but poorly fed. It looked formidable until the first real blow fell. The world was on the brink, and few recognized it. To the kings who feasted in their halls, to the peasants who sowed and harvested, to the sailors who steered their ships along familiar routes, life seemed eternal. Yet history teaches us that the very moment of greatest power is often the moment just before the fall. The chessboard was set, the pieces gleaming in bronze and gold. And somewhere beyond the horizon, an unknown hand was about to topple them all. History remembers them only as shadows. We call them the Sea Peoples. But even that name is a veil, a desperate label cast by civilizations that could not understand what was destroying them. Were they refugees driven by famine? Raiders in search of plunder? Or a coalition of displaced tribes united by hunger and desperation? The truth remains hidden in the smoke of burning cities and the silence of ruins. What we know is this: they came suddenly, and they came from the sea. Imagine standing on the coast of Canaan in the 13th century BC. The horizon darkens, not with storm clouds, but with sails. Ships unlike those of the Levantine merchants crowd the waters, low and swift, their prows carved into the shapes of beasts. They move in formation, not the haphazard craft of fishermen, but a fleet bred for war. On their decks stand warriors in horned helmets and feathered crests. Armed with long swords and javelins, their shields gleaming in the sun. To the terrified inhabitants of Ugarit or Ashkelon, it must have seemed that the sea itself had risen to disgorge an army. They struck like lightning, Ports were sacked before help could arrive, harbors burned, fleets destroyed. The sea peoples were not content to raid, they sought annihilation. They cut down crops, slaughtered livestock, and left granaries smoking. They came not to subjugate, but to erase. Cities that had stood for centuries were leveled in days. Their victims did not record treaties or tribute. They sent last pleas for help etched in clay. The enemy is upon us. Our ships are lost. We cannot hold. Send aid swiftly. But no aid came, for their neighbors were already under siege themselves. Like a rush in Age of Empires, their strategy was devastating in its simplicity. Strike fast, strike wide, deny the enemy time to recover. They knew that the great empires, for all their armies, were ponderous beasts, slow to muster, slow to respond. Against chariots and standing armies that relied on open fields and long supply lines, these raiders brought mobility, unpredictability, and total war. Who were they? The inscriptions of Pharaoh Ramesses III list names that still baffle scholars. The Peliset, Sherdun, Shekelesh, Dinyan, Weshesh. Some may have come from Anatolia, others from the Aegean, still others from lands now lost to history. Perhaps they were peoples displaced by earthquakes, drought, or famine, banding together in desperate coalitions. Perhaps they were exiles from fallen kingdoms, carrying vengeance as their banner. In truth, they may have been all of these, a storm of migrations, each wave feeding the next, until the Mediterranean convulsed with chaos. To the victims, identity mattered little. To them, the sea peoples were simply death. The fall of Ugarit is one of the starkest examples. This once thriving port, hub of trade between East and West, was reduced to ash. Excavators centuries later found its archives buried beneath collapsed walls, clay tablets frozen mid-message, letters unanswered, contracts unfulfilled. A civilization interrupted mid-sentence. Hattusa, the proud capital of the Hittites, fell not long after. Fires swept its palaces, its archives vanished, and with them, the memory of an empire. Even mighty Egypt staggered before the onslaught. Ramesses III, one of the last warrior pharaohs, confronted them in a battle immortalized on the walls of Medinet Habu. The inscriptions show chaotic naval combat, Egyptian archers firing from ships, enemy vessels capsized, prisoners bound in chains. The pharaoh boasted of victory, of having crushed the sea peoples once and for all. Yet his triumph was the triumph of survival. Egypt endured, but barely, drained of wealth and strength, never again to command the Mediterranean as it had before. The sea peoples left behind no chronicles of their own. Their story is told only through the voices of those who suffered. And perhaps that is fitting, for their legacy was not in the cities they built, but in the cities they destroyed. They were the unmakers of the Bronze Age, the hammer that shattered its fragile network of trade, kingship, and faith. Even today, the mystery haunts us. Were they heroes or villains, victims or conquerors? Perhaps they were both. Families fleeing famine who became marauders out of necessity, wanderers who turned into destroyers when no home welcomed them. History rarely grants us such clarity. What we know is that they were the agents of collapse, the dark tide against which the glittering empires proved powerless. The ancients saw them as demons rising from the sea, and in a sense they were right. For like demons, the sea peoples emerged from the shadows of history, wrought devastation, and then vanished back into obscurity. Their coming was a mystery, their going just as sudden. But in their wake lay the ruins of an age. Thus, the world trembled. The mighty empires that once seemed eternal now found themselves besieged not only by external enemies, but by internal weakness. The sea peoples did not create the cracks, but they forced them wide open, turning weakness into collapse. In the game of history, they were the unexpected rush that toppled civilizations already stretched too thin. The world would never be the same. Civilizations do not die quietly. They collapse in fire. In the twilight of the Bronze Age, one city after another fell as if the very earth itself had turned against humanity. Across the Mediterranean, the jewels of empire, ports, fortresses, palaces, were consumed by smoke. To watch them vanish was to witness the death of memory itself. On the Syrian coast, Ugarit burned. This was the proud city of merchants and scribes, a place where caravans from Anatolia, ships from Cyprus, and envoys from Egypt mingled in crowded harbors. Here, the first alphabet had been etched into clay, a gift destined to change the story of mankind. And yet, in its final hours, Ugarit sent desperate pleas scratched onto tablets. The enemy is at the gates. Our fleet is lost. We have no defense. Those cries never reached salvation. The messengers carried them too late, or perhaps never left at all. When excavators uncovered them centuries later, the city had long since turned to dust. Its libraries buried, its harbors silent. A cradle of letters ended with none left to speak for it. Far to the north, the Hittite capital of Hattusa met the same fate. For centuries, its kings had ruled from behind colossal stone walls carved with lions and sphinxes. Treaties were signed there with the might of Egypt, and armies thundered forth from its gates. But when the storm came, Hattusa was swallowed whole. Palaces that once blazed with torches became pyres of ruin. Its archives vanished, its temples blackened, its empire broken into silence. Today, only broken stones remain, as if the gods themselves abandoned the fortress they had once blessed. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean kings fared no better. Their fortresses, Mycenae, Tyrans, Pylos, stood like titans over the Greek hills, adorned with gates of lions and halls fit for heroes. Later ages would sing of Agamemnon and Achilles, but the singers came after the fire. In the final days, scribes recorded frantic inventories, armor counted, chariots prepared, weapons seized from storehouses. Yet none of it mattered. The flames came swiftly, and the walls cracked under assault. The palaces fell, one after another, until Greece itself sank into centuries of silence. Writing disappeared, trade ceased, and the land of heroes became a wasteland of forgotten names. Nor was the Levant spared. Ashkelon, Hazor, Gaza, cities of Canaan that had endured for generations, were struck down. Temples collapsed, fields lay barren, refugees scattered into the desert. Some cities rose again, rebuilt by newcomers, perhaps the Philistines, wanderers of the sea. But the old order was gone. Where once kings prayed to Baal and El, ashes smoldered in ruined sanctuaries. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Granaries burned, tombs were plundered, merchants returned to find their harbors abandoned, farmers fled their fields, clutching children as their villages vanished overnight. The intricate web of Bronze Age life unraveled thread by thread, until nothing was left but fragments. To live through such times must have felt like the very end of the world. Priests raised incense to empty skies. Kings begged the gods for deliverance and heard only silence. We can argue, from the safety of centuries, whether the cause was drought, famine, earthquake, or invasion. But to those who lived it, causes were irrelevant. What they knew was the sight of their homes in flames, their streets running with blood, their world collapsing around them. Imagine a player in Age of Empires, watching helplessly as one town center after another falls, the proud wonder reduced to rubble. That was the Bronze Age, an empire-wide defeat, drawn out not in minutes, but in decades of despair. The fall of cities was not merely the loss of stone and timber. It was the loss of continuity, the breaking of chains that bound generations together. When Ugarit burned, the alphabet nearly vanished with it. When Mycenae fell, Greece descended into a darkness where writing disappeared for 400 years. When Hattusa turned to ruins, an empire dissolved into scattered tribes. This was apocalypse, not in the sense of a sudden end, but as a drawn-out unweaving of civilization. And yet, in the smoke of burning palaces and the silence of abandoned harbors, the seeds of a new age were already stirring. But for those who lived through it, there was no comfort, no promise of rebirth, only the knowledge that the world they had known had died forever. If the Bronze Age world was collapsing in fire, then Egypt stood as the last great citadel against the storm. From the marshes of the Nile to the temples of Luxor, the old kingdom of the pharaohs still breathed, though even it felt the tremors of famine and revolt. Grain riots shook its towns, laborers mutinied at Thebes, and whispers spread that the gods had abandoned their chosen king. And yet, as cities across the Mediterranean fell silent, Egypt still raised its banners. At its helm stood Ramesses III, heir to 1,000 years of empire. He knew what had befallen his neighbors. Hattusa erased, Ugarit smoldering, the Mycenaean palaces gone. Beyond the horizon, a new terror approached, the Sea Peoples, a tide of wanderers and warriors without homeland, crashing upon every shore they found. To others, they were a scourge. To Egypt, they were destiny. The pharaoh understood. If Egypt fell, then the last pillar of the Bronze Age would shatter, and history itself would dissolve into chaos. So Ramesses prepared. He fortified the mouths of the Nile with wooden palisades and warships. He summoned archers from Nubia and charioteers from the Delta. He carved his defiance into the very stone of Medinet Habu. On those walls he declared, for gods and men alike, I am the shield of Egypt. I will break the enemy upon the river. And then they came. The Sea Peoples, tall, fierce, armored in strange helmets with horns and plumes, their families and ox-drawn wagons trailing behind them. They were not merely raiders, but migrants, entire nations on the move, desperate and merciless. Their ships filled the horizon, longboats bristling with warriors. Their spears glittered under the Egyptian sun. For the first time in centuries, the Nile itself trembled. The battle that followed was not merely war. It was apocalypse played upon the waters. Ramesses stationed archers along the banks, their bows drawn taut like the strings of fate. As the Sea People's ships pushed into the river mouths, arrows rained down, turning the Nile into a graveyard of broken oars and pierced bodies. Egyptian galleys, faster and more maneuverable, struck from the flanks. Warriors boarded the enemy vessels, hacking and pushing, sending invaders tumbling into the current. The river ran red, choked with corpses and splintered wood. On land too, the invaders clashed against Egypt's chariots. Wheels thundered across the sands, horses foaming, bronze-tipped spears thrusting into the enemy ranks. Women and children of the Sea Peoples cowered behind wagons, while warriors roared and fought to the last. The pharaoh's inscriptions tell us he stood unshaken, the living Horus, while his enemies were slaughtered without mercy. Perhaps the truth was bloodier, less glorious, but the outcome was the same. Egypt survived. It was a victory, yes, but a hollow one. The Sea Peoples were broken at the Nile, yet they did not vanish. Some settled in Canaan, becoming the Philistines of later scripture. Others melted into the ruins of Syria and Anatolia, carving new homes from the ashes of fallen empires. Egypt itself was scarred, its treasury drained, its lands restless, its gods seemingly distant. Ramesses III had saved his kingdom, but he had not saved the age. For what he preserved was a shell of former greatness. The pharaoh's triumph was the last thunderclap of the Bronze Age, a defiant blaze before the long twilight. After his reign, Egypt slipped into decline, its temples looted, its kings weakened, its people weary. The Bronze Age had not ended in a single battle or a single fall. It had ended in exhaustion. In the slow realization that the world of palaces, chariots, and gods carved in stone was gone. And yet, in that desperate stand upon the Nile, there was a strange kind of immortality. For if Egypt had fallen with Ugarit and Mycenae, perhaps nothing would have survived at all. In Ramesses' victory, fragile threads of memory endured, the names of gods, the writing of scribes, the rhythm of civilization itself. Out of the apocalypse, enough was saved to begin again. They appeared like a storm without warning, a tide of warriors and wanderers that surged across the Mediterranean, leaving wreckage in their wake. To the kings of the age, they were nameless terror. To us, centuries later, they remain a riddle carved in fragments of stone and whispered in half-forgotten chronicles. The Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu show them vividly. Men in horned helmets, women in flowing garments, ox carts loaded with children and belongings. They came not as raiders alone, but as nations uprooted, whole peoples searching for a home amid the ruins of a dying world. Their ships were sleek and deadly, their warriors hardened by hunger and exile. Wherever they landed, on Cyprus, in Anatolia, at the gates of Egypt, they fought with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose. Who were they? Scholars have debated for centuries. Some see in them the displaced Mycenaeans, driven from their palaces by famine and revolt. Others trace them to Anatolian tribes cast adrift by earthquakes and wars. Still others glimpse the ancestors of later peoples, the Philistines of Canaan, the Sicilians of the Western Sea, the Lycians of Asia Minor. Perhaps they were not one people at all, but a coalition born of desperation, a dark fraternity of refugees and warriors bound together by hunger and rage. Their story is the shadow side of the Bronze Age collapse. While kingdoms toppled under their assault, it is possible they too were victims of the same forces. Drought that withered fields, earthquakes that shattered cities, trade networks broken beyond repair. When the world they knew could no longer feed them, they took to the sea. With each passing year, their migrations swelled, like waves building toward a shore. And when they struck with the inevitability of nature itself. To the scribes of Egypt, they were chaos incarnate, those who came from the sea. But to imagine them only as destroyers is to miss their tragic humanity. Picture the longboats creaking across a moonlit sea, packed with families huddling against the salt wind, their children crying, their warriors sharpening blades by starlight. They were not marching into conquest as much as stumbling into survival, their eyes fixed desperately on any shore that might sustain them. And yet, survival for them meant destruction for others. At Ugarit, letters preserved in clay reveal the terror of their arrival. Frantic pleas to allies for aid, ships recalled too late, a city consumed in fire. At Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, they may have been the final hammer that crushed a kingdom already weakened by famine. Saktahor. In the Aegean, their raids helped snuff out the palatial world of Mycenae. Civilization after civilization toppled like reeds before the flood. But from their wanderings came strange new beginnings. Settling along the coast of Canaan, they became known to history as the Philistines, the rivals of ancient Israel, remembered in the story of Goliath. Their pottery, their weapons, their customs bore traces of Aegean origin, as if fragments of lost Mycenae had washed ashore in the Levant. Elsewhere, they disappeared into the tapestry of rising Iron Age peoples, their names forgotten, but their imprint hidden in dialects, in ruins, in legends. The Sea Peoples, then, are both villains and heirs of the Bronze Age apocalypse. They were destroyers, yes, but also carriers of change, midwives of a new world. For their invasions marked not just an end, but a beginning, the birth of the Iron Age, where empires would rise anew upon the ruins they had left behind. And so the mystery remains unsolved, like a half-buried shipwreck. Were they pirates, refugees, or both? Were they the executioners of the old world, or its orphans? Perhaps they were all of these at once. What is certain is this: when the storm of the Bronze Age collapse broke upon the shores of history, the Sea Peoples were its sharpest edge, the human face of apocalypse. One by one, the great cities of the Bronze Age flickered out like candles in a storm. Ugarit, once a jewel of the Levant, vanished in a single night of terror. The clay tablets found in its ruins still speak across 3,000 years, desperate words etched by trembling hands. The enemy ships are already here. Our cities are burning. Where are your armies? Where are your ships? But the pleas went unanswered. By the time the letter reached its intended ally, Ugarit was already ash and silence. In Anatolia, mighty Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, met a slower death. Its once proud walls, which had withstood centuries of wars, were no match for famine, revolt, and the marauding tides of the Sea Peoples. Its archives fell silent, its palaces crumbled into dust, and the empire that had rivaled Egypt simply ceased to exist. No conqueror claimed the throne. No successor rebuilt the city. It was as if an entire civilization had simply dissolved, leaving only shattered stones beneath the Anatolian sun. Across the Aegean, the palatial world of Mycenae followed a similar fate. These warrior kings, remembered dimly in Homer's tales of Agamemnon and Achilles, had once commanded fleets that sailed to Troy. Now their fortresses burned, their citadels abandoned, their people scattered. The mighty walls of Mycenae, said to have been built by giants, stood in mute witness to a collapse no army could repel. Famine gnawed at the land, and internal strife broke the backbone of the kingdom long before invaders struck the final blow. To stand in the ruins of these cities today is to feel the breath of apocalypse. Blackened layers of ash tell of fires that raged uncontrolled. Collapsed roofs entombed families who never fled. In Ugarit, merchants' houses are found with scales and weights still on the floor, as if abandoned mid-trade. In Mycenae, storerooms of grain were left untouched, suggesting that it was not lack of wealth, but a breakdown of order that doomed them. These were not slow declines, but brutal endings. Civilization, it seems, does not always fade away. It can shatter. Yet behind the wreckage lies a haunting question. Why did no city rise again upon these ruins for centuries? The Bronze Age collapse was not merely a conquest. It was a deep unraveling. Trade routes that once bound the Mediterranean together lay broken. Without tin for bronze, armies could not rearm, farmers could not replace tools, craftsmen could not sustain their arts. The fall of one city was the fall of many, for each had depended upon the other in a web too delicate to survive catastrophe. It was more than the end of kings and palaces. It was the end of a way of life. The scribes who once kept meticulous records were gone, Writing itself disappeared from Greece for nearly 400 years, a silence so deep that historians would later call it the Greek Dark Age. The fall of cities was thus also the fall of memory. Whole centuries slipped into oblivion, leaving us only broken walls and scattered myths. And yet, in this silence, something new stirred. The fall of Ugarit opened the Levant to newcomers, Phoenicians, Hebrews, Philistines, who would carve new destinies in the Iron Age. The ruins of Mycenae became the fertile soil from which Homeric legend would sprout, transforming the memory of a fallen world into poetry that would outlast empires. Even destruction, it seems, can be a kind of seed. But in that terrible moment, as cities burned and kingdoms vanished, there could have been no thought of rebirth, only loss. To those who lived it, the Bronze Age collapse must have felt like the end of the world itself. Temples desecrated, markets silent, the smoke of once great capitals curling into the sky. Civilization had entered its night, and no one could know how long that night would last. If war brought the fire, nature brought the famine. Beneath the thunder of collapsing empires lay a quieter, crueler enemy. The sky itself ceased to give. Across the eastern Mediterranean, rains grew fickle, harvests withered, and rivers shrank into trickles. The land that had once yielded abundance now cracked under a pitiless sun. Crops failed not for a season, but for decades. Starvation crept into homes more swiftly than any invading army. In Egypt, inscriptions tell of desperate days. Pharaoh Merneptah, in the late 13th century BCE, wrote of entire peoples who came to beg for food, their lives depending upon the breath of Egypt. The Nile, that eternal giver of life, had betrayed its promise. Drought gnawed at the delta, and granaries that once overflowed with wheat stood nearly empty. Even the mighty empire of the pharaohs, cushioned by centuries of plenty, felt the pangs of hunger. In Anatolia and the Levant, famine struck harder still. Letters from Ugarit speak of urgent pleas for grain, as if food itself had become more valuable than armies. In the palace storerooms, jars were left half-filled, their contents stretched thin by a desperate population. Archaeologists find charred barley seeds clinging to the ruins of hearths, evidence of meals burned in chaos or seized mid-preparation. Entire families perished, not by the sword, but by the slow cruelty of an empty stomach. And with hunger came plague. Malnutrition weakened bodies, and disease found easy purchase in the desperate crowds fleeing famine. The movement of peoples, refugees from drought-stricken lands, invaders seeking fertile soil, spread contagion faster than any physician could treat. Skeletons from this period bear marks of malnourishment, of lives cut short by invisible enemies that struck with neither warning nor mercy. The fragility of Bronze Age civilization was suddenly laid bare. These societies had been built upon delicate balances. The yearly flood of the Nile, the timely rains in Canaan, the reliable winds that carried trade ships across the Aegean. When those balances failed, the entire system cracked. Fields without water meant famine. Famine meant rebellion. Rebellion meant armies disbanded, and armies disbanded meant cities fell to any who dared to strike. The collapse was not one cause, but a chain reaction, with drought as its first cruel link. Yet famine also carried a psychological weight. A people who cannot eat lose more than strength. They lose faith. In temples from Ugarit to Thebes, priests offered desperate sacrifices, begging the gods for rain. When the skies remained silent, doubt spread like rot. Kings who claimed divine favor found their legitimacy dissolving with the harvest. Even gods seemed powerless. the social contract that bound people to palace and throne, to altar and priest, frayed under the relentless hunger of empty years. To imagine the collapse is to hear not only the clash of spears, but the hollow cough of children weakened by hunger, the weary steps of farmers abandoning cracked fields, the hushed prayers of mothers holding empty bowls. It is to see the slow agony of civilizations, undone not by glorious battles, but by the silent cruelty of the earth itself refusing its bounty. And yet, even famine carries paradox. Hunger drove migrations, scattering peoples across the Mediterranean. It was famine that sent the sea peoples in search of new lands. It was famine that forced survivors to adapt, to turn from bronze to iron, from palace economies to local resilience. Out of starvation came transformation, painful, merciless, but in time, creative. The womb of the Iron Age was not luxury, but scarcity. The Bronze Age collapse then was more than the sum of its battles. It was a convergence of human and natural disaster, where war and famine, drought and plague conspired to erase centuries of progress. Civilization is a fragile flower, and when both sword and sky turn against it, even the mightiest empires can be reduced to dust. If famine hollowed the heart of the Bronze Age, the sea peoples tore at its flesh. Out of the horizon they came, like a storm without origin, fierce and inscrutable. To the Egyptians, they were peoples from the sea, a tide of warriors and wanderers, of families burdened with carts and oxen, pushing ever forward in search of land to conquer and food to claim. They carried with them not only weapons, but an entire way of life uprooted, a migration turned into invasion. Their arrival was chaos incarnate. They struck like waves upon the fragile coasts of the eastern Mediterranean, their raids unpredictable, their origins still shrouded in mystery. Were they disinherited Mycenaeans, driven by the ruin of their palaces, exiles from Anatolia, cast adrift by famine and fire? Or a coalition of desperate peoples bound by necessity rather than blood? The chronicles do not answer, but their deeds are carved into stone and memory. In Egypt, the walls of Medinet Habu still speak of the terror. There, Pharaoh Ramesses III recorded his triumph over these invaders, depicting ships locked in battle upon the Nile Delta, enemy warriors tumbling into the waters, their oared galleys engulfed by Egyptian firepower. Yet the very need to etch such a victory in stone betrays how close the threat had come. Egypt, weakened by drought and unrest, was nearly swallowed whole. Elsewhere, the sea peoples left only silence. Ugarit, once a flourishing port, was reduced to ashes, its last letters desperate calls for aid that never arrived. The Hittite Empire, that proud power of Anatolia, crumbled before their advance, its capital Hattusa abandoned, its great archives scattered and burned. Even mighty Mycenae, cradle of heroes, could not withstand the storm. Cities that had stood for centuries became ruins, their names fading into myth. Their weapons were as relentless as their hunger. They wielded new tools of war, long swords for slashing rather than thrusting, round shields that gave mobility, tactics that unsettled the old chariot-based armies of the Bronze Age. The elegance of palace warfare, with its rituals of honor and elite warriors, collapsed before the brute ferocity of massed infantry. The sheer desperation of people fighting not for glory, but for survival. And yet, the sea peoples were more than destroyers. They were harbingers of change. Their migrations scattered fragments of cultures across the Mediterranean, sowing seeds of new nations. The Philistines in Canaan, whose pottery still carries echoes of the Aegean, perhaps even the ancestors of later Mediterranean tribes who would rise from obscurity in the Iron Age. What they shattered, they also remade, though not intentionally. Destruction was their gift, and transformation its consequence. To imagine their onslaught is to picture a world undone not only by swords, but by the sheer tide of human desperation. Families trudging behind warbands, oxen straining under wagons piled with meager belongings, children clinging to mothers' robes as cities burned behind them. They were not a mere army, but a civilization in motion, a civilization of the dispossessed. The Sea Peoples embody the paradox of the collapse. Invaders and refugees, destroyers and survivors, scourge and seed. To those who faced them, they were apocalypse incarnate, the final blow to already faltering kingdoms. But to history, they were also the bridge into a new era. The Bronze Age ended not only in flames, but in migrations that would redraw the very map of the Mediterranean. And when the storm had passed, when the tide of war and hunger and migration at last subsided, the world that remained was unrecognizable. The palaces were gone, the empires dissolved, the old certainties shattered. In their place rose a harsher, leaner age, the age of iron, of new peoples forging their destinies in the ruins of the old. When the storm had passed, silence lay heavy upon the world. The once great palaces of Mycenae, Ugarit, and Hattusa stood as blackened shells, their walls cracked, their storerooms looted, their archives turned to ash. The light of the Bronze Age, the age of kings and chariots, of merchants and scribes, of treaties etched in clay and gods carved in stone, had flickered and died. What remained was a landscape of ruins, scattered survivors, and a long, uncertain dawn. The collapse had spared no one. Trade routes that once bound the Mediterranean like golden threads had unraveled into nothingness. Ships no longer carried copper from Cyprus or tin from distant lands. Artisans no longer smelted bronze for the weapons of kings. Farmers tilled what soil remained fertile, but without the stability of states to protect them. Many lived as fugitives on their own land. For centuries, literacy, the proud tool of scribes, disappeared from Greece, leaving only oral memory, songs carried by wandering bards to preserve the ghosts of heroes long gone. And yet, within this darkness, new beginnings stirred. Iron, once a rarity, emerged as the common tool of survival. Harder and more abundant than bronze, it armed farmers and soldiers alike, democratizing both labor and war. What the Sea Peoples and famine had destroyed, iron would rebuild, not in palatial grandeur, but in the rough resilience of village life. From the ashes of Canaan's cities, the Philistines built their towns, weaving Aegean and Levantine traditions into a new identity. In the hills of Judah and Israel, small tribes would one day give birth to stories that outlived empires. In Greece, though palaces had fallen, seeds were planted for a rebirth, the polis, the city-state, where freedom and debate would one day replace the rigid rule of kings. Egypt, wounded but unbroken, retreated into itself, never again to stride so confidently beyond its borders. The Hittites were gone, their empire dissolved like smoke, their language lost until modern scholars unearthed it from the clay. And in Mesopotamia, where Assyria bided its time, new powers gathered strength, ready to inherit the stage once the silence lifted. The Bronze Age collapse was no single catastrophe, no singular day of doom, but a long twilight, a slow unweaving of a tapestry centuries in the making. Yet in that unraveling lay the threads of renewal. The Mediterranean had been a stage of kings, It would now become a crucible for peoples. The age of palaces ended, but the age of nations began. If one listens closely, the ruins still speak, not in words, but in lessons. That no empire, however glorious, is immune to the weight of hunger, the fury of migration, or the blind hand of nature. That civilization is fragile, yet resilient. It can be burned to the ground, but from the embers, it will rise again, transformed. Thus the curtain fell on the Bronze Age, a Mediterranean apocalypse, a collapse without equal. And yet, from the silence, there came new voices. From ruin, new life. From darkness, a new dawn. The Iron Age had begun. And so, the story of the Bronze Age collapse closes, not as a simple ending, but as a reminder. Civilizations rise and civilizations fall, yet humanity endures. From ashes, new worlds are born. If you found this journey through the ruins of empires as moving as I did, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to the channel, so together we can uncover more lost ages, more forgotten kingdoms, more echoes of the past. And I would love to hear your thoughts. Was the collapse an apocalypse, or the birth of something greater? Share your ideas in the comments below, and let's keep history alive. Not in dusty books, but in our conversations. Until the next chapter in the rise and fall of civilizations, stay curious.